Pharisees and any of the other religious groups. We didn't say it's compatible. We said it's more compatible than with any other group. We're going to lead up to what we're going to be discussing tonight. Then we said, although his theology is more compatible with their group than any other, you can't deny the fact that there's a lot of hostility seen in the Gospels between him and the Pharisees. Remember, he gives some teaching over in Matthew 15, and I down in verse 12, when after he gave this, his disciples said to him, "Teacher, knowest thou not that the Pharisees were offended by these things?" And we see that they are sending out delegations to check his teaching. It's the most difficult thing you could ask of him, to keep his composure and thoughts with the presence of many enemies in every congregation that he ever ministered to. On several occasions, the end of his message came rather abruptly, probably before he was through, and it came with a lynch mob, a mob that wanted to hang him, kill him, stone him, or throw him over the precipice, the brow that the city of Nazareth was built upon, the brow of the hill. We see that starting in Matthew 12, and from then on out, and we gave you all these passages last time, the Pharisees, in conjunction with some of the other religious groups, had come upon one final desire, and that was to see Jesus terminated. And they labored the next few months, and of course we know they're finally successful. They labored the next few months to realize that desire of theirs, his termination or his execution. And I said it's no wonder that the writer of Hebrews could say in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 3, "Consider him who endured such contradiction of sinners against himself." Consider him who endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. The writer of Hebrews saying you haven't even resisted unto blood yet, striving against sin. You've just been resisting some petty trials, and isn't that true of all of us? Amen. Hebrews 12:4, that's verse 4 I'm on now quoting. Hebrews 12:4 is to us. Hebrews 12:3, well, it's to us to consider, but we haven't endured what Jesus endured. And it's no wonder that he himself could say to those very same Pharisees in John chapter 8 and verse 40, "Ye now go about to kill me, a man that ever told you the truth." Amen. John 8:40, "You seek now to kill me, a man that ever told you the truth." So, what I'm saying in putting these numbers up here is it seems like we have some type of contradiction on our hands. There's a lot of compatibility, theologically anyway, between Jesus, his beliefs, and those of the Pharisees. And yet you can't deny, even on one cursory reading of the New Testament, the four Gospels, a lot of hostility existed between them. So I left you last time with this question for you to be mulling over in your mind and meditating on during the week. If they weren't having problems among themselves over some of these things we saw under number 1 last time, various theological and I guess some practical beliefs of Jesus, but basically it was in doctrine and theology, then just what was it, just where was it they had so much disagreement between themselves? And I said, I think you can reduce that to basically 2 different things, and that's going to be our discussion tonight. Hallelujah. I think that you can reduce, and remember who the Pharisees are. They are the conservatives of their day. They are the lay disciples, as it were. They're not any professional trained group. They are the lay disciples of the professional trained group, the theologians, the biblical scholars of their day, whom we know to be the scribes. And so whatever we say concerning the Pharisees has very direct and immediate application for any age of God's people. And I think it has particular reference and some very strong implications for the day and age in which we live with denominational Christianity. Some people, maybe you found yourself saying this, the Bible doesn't have anything to say about denominationalism. Well, I trust all we mean by that is that you won't ever find the foundation of any denominational church in the Bible. You don't find the Lutherans or the Catholics or the Baptists or whomever being founded somewhere in the pages of the New Testament. But you do have a lot about denominationalism. Because what is that but a man's system of religion? It's man's system, man's way versus God's way. Now, you're a heretic on the scene today to pronounce like that. They put you as a cult. If you pronounce that the denominations are man's way and not God's way. But this will, as we'll see tonight, this is precisely what the New Testament says. It doesn't have to speak to any particular denomination today. It couldn't. They weren't in existence then, which is only proof of that fact that you couldn't go back to the New Testament as some denominations attempt to and locate your origin. But your forefathers are there. Because man's religion has always been on the scene, and it's always been set in opposition against the true way, the narrow way, which is God's way. So I want to give this message to you tonight under two headings in, the two basic major areas of disagreement between Jesus and the Pharisees. Between Jesus, as he is still Lord today, between Jesus and man's religion, even man's conservative religion. And I would say especially man's conservative religion. Because all of the liberals are going to be wrong on doctrinal points. So there's no problem there. You can just cast them out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. But not the conservatives, though. You kind of hesitate saying too much evil or negative or whatever about them because you see so much right as far as doctrine is concerned. Maybe you even learn some of your doctrine or the finer points of it from some conservative theologian. Well, God can make even the wrath of the wicked to praise him, remember. He can use donkeys for his own purposes. I've said before, we can glean some from the sinners out there. Leave the sinners in their mess and glean some from them. Number one. Now, I don't know what you came up with. We're not going to take a poll tonight. I know some of you are just itching to tell me what your two answers are, but you can tell me afterwards. Because yours might be wrong. So we wouldn't want to embarrass you, right? And you surely don't want Brother David to answer this question. He's always wrong. We love you, brother. Okay, number one. The major basic areas of disagreement. Number one, we're going to be saying it as it concerns the Pharisees. Their gross lack of personal piety. Their gross lack of personal piety. Now, they had a lot of good theology, but much of the stress was on a salvation by works, a salvation by certain doctrines and certain thoughts, which just promotes legalism and self-righteousness and an epidemic hypocrisy in their midst. A gross lack of personal piety. Now, we have a whole lot of scriptures to look at tonight. Let's do those in reversed order. Let's start with the epidemic hypocrisy that existed in Israel of that day among the conservatives, the Pharisees. We've got many passages for this. Matthew 23, we're not going to read all of these because some of this will be duplication. At least the giving of the passages will be duplication of what we've already either given and or read earlier. But Matthew 23, 4 to 33, what's the whole chapter about? Scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. So I don't think we need to read that. We've even got a series of tapes on that. Matthew 23, verses 4 to 33. The hypocrisy and pride. The hypocrisy and pride of the Pharisees. Hypocrisy, and I'm putting both of these under one heading, although you could probably separate them. Hypocrisy in saying one thing and doing another. Not living the right type of life, we could say, although they might have had good doctrine on occasion, good theology. We saw some areas where they did have good theology earlier. Pride, like in Luke 11 and verse 43. They, along with their mentors, the scribes, like greetings in the marketplaces. They like special garments, special robes, so that they are well known by the people. As I've told you over the years, ever since I've been at this church, you see the same things manifested out there. People name their ministries or their whatever after themselves. They name their lands after themselves, such and such evangelistic association, incorporated. You have to take a deep breath to even pronounce the name of the group. Instead of just the Church of the Lord, or the Disciples, or you couldn't get any shorter than the Way. Of course, we got a cult now called the Way, so we're kind of stuck there. But they've usurped something that belongs to the Bible. It doesn't belong to them, because they aren't part of the Way. Just the other way is what we should call them. That's the broad way, the other way. And people insist that you call them what? Reverend, or doctor, or parson, or all these man-made, invented terms. A lot of pride involved in that. A lot of pride involved in the education. Of course, the Pharisees didn't have that, but their mentors did, the scribes, and they are the ones who came up with the conservative doctrines. A lot of pride in all of that intellectual nonsense. A lot of them insist on being called doctor. They earn the degree, and they want the prestige with that. So, an epidemic hypocrisy and pride. Jesus never went to school, never was a great traveler, never was well known anywhere except locally, and that as a lunatic. He couldn't give, as a lot of pastors have to. We've got this back on some earlier tapes on conditions for spirituality. He couldn't give a long list of things: serve, combat, Korea, Vietnam, decorated, soldier, this, that, and the other, engineer for McDonnell Douglas, that makes the airplanes or whatever. He couldn't give any of that. Well, let's see. Born in a manger, that's where it began. No lavish birth or no party, or no one even noticed except the angels, all the angels in heaven. No one else notices around. He starts his resume with that. In other words, no blue blood. God's own blood, but you see, the world doesn't recognize that, though. They have a different standard. It's a worldly, carnal standard of judgment and measurement. And they didn't see anything in him that was becoming or befitting of God. They didn't see anything in him. When they looked at him, Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 53, they thought God was punishing him. That's how mixed up they were. Punishing him for his sins. That's how mixed up they were in their minds. When we shall behold him, there's no beauty in him that we should desire him. There's nothing in him that they saw. No degrees and no travel and no promotions or being promoted by anyone else. Over in Luke chapter 12, we might read a few verses that we haven't read. We've read Matthew 23 and Luke 11 in this series earlier. We haven't read in Luke 12, beginning with verse 1. Jesus just has to go right down the line. Born in a manger. My cousin, who was that? Well, he's that lunatic that eats locusts and wild honey. It's not good to have relatives like that. Or if you do, you remember back in President Carter's days, you try to shun those relatives. I don't know who you are. Get away from me. But he publicly identified with his cousin. What did he say? Of the people born of women, none has arisen greater than this man, John the Baptist. He identified in no uncertain terms with this man that was a lunatic, lived with the snakes and lizards in the desert, and ate locusts. You know what those things are. Flies, bugs he ate. I'm not saying go out and do that to prove anything. That won't make you a prophet now. To go do that. But look at what Jesus would just have to report on his resume. There's nothing there that's worthy of anything except worthy of the scorning of this world. Is it any wonder that Paul could write in 1 Corinthians 1 in verse 21, the world by wisdom knew not God. You don't know God by wisdom, you know him by revelation. Amen. You don't know him by discovering him or finding him one day. You know him when he reveals himself to you. So you go from manger to cousin that eats locusts to, well, I didn't accomplish anything in all these years except I just followed in my earthly father's footsteps and I was trained to be a carpenter. And a carpenter, that's just lowly, menial work. That's manual labor. He didn't sail to seek his fortune in Rome. No one told him, go west, young man. Rome is where you should be. The Senate, you'd make an excellent senator. You're the son of God. Or maybe Caesar. You could control the world because the world is yours anyway. Nothing on his resume at all. The Pharisees and the scribes, on the contrary, were seeking after these things and boasting in these things. Greetings in the marketplace, to be called what? Rabbi, Rabbi. Special seats in the synagogue. Special seats in the meeting places. This is back in Luke chapter 11, as well as over in Luke chapter 20, I believe. And you see over in Matthew 23, special things to their garments, and they wore their little phylacteries on their arms and their foreheads so they could show that we are God's people. We have God's law. And it's just so typical of the denoms out there, whether it's a big 18-pound cross around their neck or something. They'll wear these things, but it's not in their heart, though. Jesus didn't say to take up a cross to put it on your neck or go stand it in a corner or put it on a church steeple or a church stationery, but to die on it. You take up crosses to die on them. Luke 12, I'll finally start reading this. In the meantime, when they were gathered together, now Luke's giving of this account's a little different than Matthew's over in Matthew 16. But that just means that Jesus' teaching was multifaceted. An innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say unto his disciples first of all, and this is what he said to his disciples first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, none of the scholars out there in the church world today could dispute any of the factual information we've already given in this class so far about who the Pharisees were. There's no other group possible in that day that you could identify the so-called conservatives of our day and age today with. There's no other group that you could identify them with but the Pharisees and the scribes. I think then the implication, the conclusion is obvious. What was true then is true today. Their counterparts are with us today. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. For there is nothing covered. You know, they made a lot of laws and tried to find out ways to skirt them. We'll look at some of those later, hopefully tonight. But Jesus is saying that it's not just what they have said or what you have caught them doing, like when they want you to catch them giving alms and praying and fasting, Matthew 6, verses 1 to 18. It's not just those things that people will know. Everything is going to be made known, including those things that are hidden. There's nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known. Now, a true disciple knows things like that, and he knows that it's God's requirement on his soul to live as though God were around him 24 hours a day, because he is. That you don't, as a true disciple, have the luxury of living good at church in front of people and living like the devil and in the world the rest of the week. A true disciple knows this. A true disciple has this understanding. Now, a conservative out there, no, he doesn't necessarily have that at all. He knows there are certain religious duties and obligations that he has to fulfill and maintain. But there are some secret things that he doesn't have to do, or whenever he's in secret and people aren't watching him, he can do things he's not supposed to do. But Jesus said everything's going to be made known. Verse 3, therefore whatsoever ye have spoken in darkness shall be heard in the light, and that which ye have spoken in the ear in closet shall be proclaimed upon the housetops. And I say unto you, my friends. He doesn't call them that very often. He does over in John 15, and he does here in Luke. I say unto you, my friends, be not afraid of them. He's talking to his disciples, remember, in verse 1. Be not afraid of them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. But I will forewarn you whom ye shall fear. Fear him which, after he hath killed, hath power to cast into hell. Yea, I say unto you, fear him. But what does hypocrisy and pride teach us so? The man who has that fears only other men. He wants to do things that wins approval and gains acceptance in their eyes. He fears only them, and not the God who's all-seeing and all-searching, the God of Hebrews 4 and verse 13, the one with whom we have to do. So an epidemic hypocrisy and pride was manifested by the Pharisees. I'm saying this is part A, of their gross lack of personal piety. Jesus, and as we'll see when we get through with this first point here, he just throws out the conservative theology that they had, because whatever good that could have done them is nullified by their impious lifestyle. Whatever good theology could have done, and it should do us some good, is nullified by their lack of personal piety. Then, secondly, we're still under this first point, their gross lack of personal piety. Secondly, their self-righteousness. Their self-righteousness. I guess that's best seen here in the same gospel, in Luke chapter 18, verses 11 and 12. Luke 18, verses 11 and 12. By the way, this is our last study on the Pharisees, so what we need to say, we have to say to finish tonight. Some of these verses we haven't looked at before. Luke 18, 11 to 12. Self-righteousness. The Pharisee. Now, it's not a Sadducee, because he just, as we'll see when we study the Sadducees later, he wouldn't even be in a position to be saying some of the things the Pharisee does. He's so liberal and left-wing. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners and unjust, adulterers. Well, that's not the type of prayer you're supposed to be praying. God, I thank you that I'm not a sinner like the rest of the world is out there. Your prayer life is not to be thanking God you're not like the sinners out there, but to gain some strength from God to be overcoming what you know are sins in your own life. Self-righteousness here. God, I thank you I'm not like other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers. Or even as this publican, this tax collector. I fast twice in the week, and I give tithes of all that I possess. Well, remember Jesus said that true, warm, devotional, personal piety would have the left hand not even knowing what the right hand has done. He has kept count of everything. I give tithes of all. I fast twice a week. He's always announcing it. He's announcing it to himself in his own personal prayer life. Surely he's broadcasting it to everyone else. And Matthew 6 would inform us of that fact. Self-righteousness. I think their self-righteousness is also seen in their criticism of Jesus for associating on occasions with certain types of people. Like in chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. I mean, it's specifically stated in those two verses that the Pharisees were angry with him because he associated with the wrong type of people. Now, he associated with them because they were the only ones open to his message. Or let me say it this way, they were the only ones that were even possibly open to his message. Most of the Pharisees, by virtue of the fact of who they were, Pharisees, had effectively excluded themselves from the kingdom of God. So he mingled with those who knew they were sick. Doctors can't help those who think that they have no need. And same gospel, Luke chapter 7 and verse 30. Luke 7 is the case of the woman who's simply called the woman who's the sinner. We're never told what sin she commits, but it's probably rather obvious when you read the passage what sin she had committed. Now, Jesus, in fellowshipping with someone like that, is not condoning her sin. As a matter of fact, if you read Luke 7, what the whole account about is he forgives her of her sin, and in effect, it tells her, go and sin no more. Now, he's not saying, well, I like sin, and I like sinners who are in their sin. It's just that this is a woman who, because of maybe the nature of her sin, she knows that she's guilty. And only when you know that you're guilty can you ever have any hope of receiving forgiveness from God. And Simon, who's the Pharisee in this chapter, Luke 7, he thinks, well, if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what type of woman this is who's touched him. Jesus is a prophet. He knows what type of woman. That's the whole point of the matter. But better than that, he knows the man who thought if he was a prophet, he would know such and such things. Better than that, you see, Jesus knew the man who didn't think that Jesus knew the woman. He knew the woman and he knew the man. He knew the woman's sinful condition, and he knew the self-righteous mentality of this Pharisee. Yes, he does dine with him, and we've looked at that earlier, the scribes and their meals together. We don't need to go back over that again. And then thirdly, legalism. Praise the Lord. We sang a song tonight from Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1. It was for freedom that Christ set us free.
Amen.
So be not entangled again in the yoke of bondage. I couldn't help but think of what I'd be teaching on tonight. What a yoke of bondage, conservative denominationalism is. With its 101 don'ts, which most of the time are biblical do's, and its 101 do's, which most of the time are biblical don'ts. And they have a big problem with the few don'ts that we have. And if you looked at the don'ts they had, and you looked at the do's they have, whew, and 99% of them are unscriptural. At least our don'ts are God's don't do's. Thou shalt not. Their thou shalt nots are, well, thou shalt not because a man said thou shalt not. Or thou shalt because a man has said that. Legalism means that law to them has degenerated into work salvation. They don't love the law for the righteousness of the law itself. They love the law because they think that if we can kind of construe it this way or that way and kind of delve into this, and we win our salvation and righteousness through the keeping of it. So law to them had degenerated into an overly concerned attitude toward the minutiae. You know, that's the term that just means those relatively insignificant things. Jesus rebukes this in Matthew 23:23. They are tithing down to the little seeds that they plant in their garden. And Jesus said, well, you know, if you want to do that, okay, but in doing that, you have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. Faith. Matthew 23:23. You have omitted the weightier matters of the law, because the law to you is no longer the law as it was given and intended. The law to you has become legalism, the degeneration of it into an overly concerned attitude about all of the minutiae. Such laws as theirs on cleanliness, their laws on fasting, Mondays and Thursdays. We know from the records they fasted twice a week. Well, that Pharisee told us that he did. In Luke chapter 18 and verse 12, he said, I fast twice a week and give tithes of all. Well, we know he gives tithes of all. Matthew 23:23 sets that forth. And we know that he fasted twice a week because even the rabbinical records tell us that, and it names the days, Monday and Thursday. Those were Pharisaic fasting days. Fast 2 days. Better than one, I guess. Their laws on praying, their laws on tithing, were for the most part void of any meaningful content. They were void of any meaningful content. They were just going through empty motions. And if you wonder why people ever degenerate into legalism, it's because keeping those little stupid whatevers are a lot easier than getting into the whole spirit of the Old Testament, if you were a Jew then, or getting into the whole spirit of the New Testament and obeying the spirit of the law or the spirit of the New Testament teaching. It's a lot easier to find a little list of things and tack them up and try to abide by them. And it's really easy if that list of things are just relatively minor, insignificant things, to get into judgment and mercy and faith. Matthew 23:23 takes a lot more personal piety. And that's just what we're saying. They had a gross lack of that. Well, let me give you some verses that would fit under legalism that we're not going to look up. Luke 11:37 to 42. Mark 2:18. I don't know why I've got them in this order. I'm back to Luke now. Luke 5:33. And Matthew 23:23 and Matthew 6, verses 1 to 18. You see, in Matthew 6, those are three worthy deeds that they're performing: giving, praying, and fasting. But it's degenerated into legalism for them. They think that in doing this, somehow something great is going to be given them in the kingdom. Instead of counting such things as giving and praying and fasting a privilege, they kind of saw it as, works of supererogation or something. Instead of, it's a privilege to be able to do that. It's a privilege to pray. It's a privilege to fast. It's a privilege to give. It's not as though you get something extra. You ought to just think it's a privilege. And the Pharisees never thought that. To them, anything beyond just putting your own shoes on, that's extra works for them. And, of course, you want to construe it that way. If you can construe it as extra works, and what do you get in the next life? Extra rewards. If you can get a lot of extra works in there. And you see, the biblical teaching is whenever you've done everything, then just say, I'm an unprofitable slave.
Amen.
That you don't ever get above the level that's required of you. And for the Pharisees, and that's because the Bible establishes such a high level, but the Pharisees established a very, very low level. That way it's easy to jump over that and go on for better things. See, that's man's religion for you right there. God's level is so high, he said, you won't ever attain it. Not in this life, not completely. Whenever you've done everything, just say, well, it's my duty. I haven't done any works of supererogation. For the Pharisees, just about everything was a work of supererogation because they established such low limits for themselves. Let me give you some examples that I've come across in reading about the Pharisees over the years of some of this lack of personal piety. I guess it kind of would tie in with all three of these things: hypocrisy and self-righteousness and legalism. But here are some of the examples of things that they, could or couldn't do. Just to show how there's no personal piety. They have conservative doctrine, they are religiously minded people, and they're zealous. But they're zealous without true knowledge of the Word and without true personal piety. Here's one example. These are these are rather humorous, and you find their descendants in institutional religion today. One law of the Pharisees was and they got this from the scribes. They laid down the laws, and the Pharisees held the banner up.
For the continuation of this message, please